There you go.
All right.
Hi, everyone. Welcome and welcome to those of you who will be watching later the recording of this session. This is Kaye Crawford, and she is going to be presenting on the power of Catholic K through 8 schools to reduce prejudice and bias. Thank you so much, Kaye, and I will turn it over to
Absolutely.
you.
Great. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here. I'm going to share my screen right now, and I see there's Albert. All right. Oh, okay. What just happened?
It looks like it's thinking, Kaye.
My whole screen just went black,
Oh, oh my goodness.
and it looks like it's thinking. Mm, 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 mm.
Let's see. If worse comes to worse, I can probably go grab your PowerPoint out
Oh,
of.
wait a second. It just
So you are breaking up, and now it may be a slow internet connection. Okay, there you go. I see your PowerPoint now, but I do not see you, and I do not see.
okay. All
Okay, I
right.
hear you
All
now.
right. Well then, okay. And you can hear me,
Yes.
and so it is just saying that there was a Zoom. So uh, that was the weird. It has never it has never happened like that before.
We had a little bit of trouble, like I mentioned earlier in another session. So it may just be the platform, but it's now closed captioning. So
Okay.
it just may be a lot of technical. It just may be a lot of information for it to process. Um,
Right.
but we can see your screen and we can see you and hear you. So if you want to go ahead and.
Okay. All right, perfect. Well, then we will just continue, and I don't know how to get the closed captioning off, but perhaps that is a good thing. So just a moment to ask you to look at the slide, and this is a brief rundown of my experience, my focus in research and studies, and then my volunteer work, not only through NCEA and also my diocese on the Black Catholic Advisory Board, but also working with schools in Uganda, and that I have had several roles in Catholic school. I am a proud product of Catholic schools from Galveston, Houston. I taught in a small Catholic school, and I was an adjunct faculty member at another. And my husband and I have 3 grown children, all of whom have attended Catholic school. We were Catholic school parents for 32 years. So I know well what the power of Catholic schools is. And today specifically, we're going to talk about the power of Catholic schools to reduce prejudice or bias formation in children. So just briefly to give you a rundown of what today or the next hour or so will look like, we're going to visit some church teachings on racism. We are going to discuss the work of leading child psychologists who are experts on how children form bias. We are going to look at USCCB directives to Catholic teaching institutions. We are going to see ways that we can move from the pastoral letter to actually the praxis of social justice teachings. And I'm going to introduce you to a tool, an anti-racism curriculum tool that is currently available, which works to reduce bias formation and celebrates the universality of the church. So the best way to start is definition, so that we are all on the same page by what we mean about certain words. And so I would ask you to take a minute and read what the definition of bias is. See that bias or prejudice then can be seen as in-group or out-group bias. And then see the definition for racism and how racism differs from just bias. So Open Wide Our Hearts was the pastoral letter that was written in November of 2018, where the USCCB addresses racism, specifically that racism that is directed toward the Black community and the Native American community. But Open Wide Our Hearts is not the first encyclical or pastoral letter from the church addressing racism. We're going to talk about a few that have been created by the church hierarchy since Vatican II. And in starting, the first one I'd like to talk about is Lumen Gentium, which was part of the Vatican II set of writings that came. And it says that any kind of social or cultural discrimination must be curbed and eradicated as incompatible with God's design. And that was written in 1965. These words of JP2 are much more recent, but he again says that racism unfortunately shows up in new and unexpected ways. It always morphs into something different so that it can continue. And if we think about the history of our nation and we think about slavery, moving to the Black codes, then to Jim Crow, then to now what we would call institutional racism, that isn't as direct and isn't as easily seen, but it is just as equally oppressive. These are quotes from Open Wide Our Hearts, and I'll give you a minute to look at them. And why the USCCB is stating that, even though they have done several other writings, the racist attitudes and actions are still continuing today. And so they knew that it was the right time right now to readdress this. So on the bottom quote, the bishops make reference to societal realities. And so that would be what you would consider de facto situations. So there's de jure, which is the actual civil law that they reference. And then there's de facto, what actually happens within society. And so we are going to take a look right now at a few societal realities from 2018. So I'm going to give you a minute to look over these, and then we're just going to briefly touch on each one of those. So in each one of these events, a Black individual was doing everyday activities. The April event was from two gentlemen who were at Starbucks and were waiting for a third colleague to come before they were ordered. The other April is a young teen who overslept and stopped to try and get directions from a neighbor. The May episode is a college student at Yale and fell asleep in the common room. Likely she was pulling an all-nighter. In September, this episode happened in Dallas, where Botham Jean, who was in his own apartment eating ice cream, was shot and killed when the off-duty police officer came into the apartment thinking it was hers and immediately began shooting. The October episode is a young Black man who is just trying to get into his apartment in St. Louis, and this white woman has decided that he doesn't belong there. So in each one of these situations, who holds the power to determine who belongs in which public spaces? And in these episodes and events that I have highlighted, a white individual decided that they did not belong in that space simply because of the color of their skin. They had not done anything threatening or out of the ordinary. They were doing what everybody else was doing and what each of us do. But this is an example of privilege, this ability to determine who is allowed in what spaces, and then further to be given the benefit of the doubt when you are in the space that you belong. And so we can carry this on to situations where if you are shopping and you are a white woman, you likely will not be followed. Whereas Black women will get followed by store clerks at a much higher rate. We can look at the way that Black children are disciplined in schools versus the way white children are disciplined in school, based on a groundbreaking study by Texas A&M University called Breaking School Rules. So I would ask you for just a minute, if you could please choose one of these examples, and if you are Anglo, if you could please put the face of your child, your brother, your spouse in the victim's space and answer the question to yourself, would their body alone elicit fear or concern? And so as an example, I typically take the May example of my daughter, who is in her 30s now, but when she was in college, if she had fallen asleep in the common room of her dorm, would the police have been called? And the answer would be no. So in Open Wide Our Hearts, the USCCB acknowledges that racism festers in part because as a nation, we have been very limited in atoning for the damage that's been done and even acknowledging the history. And I would say that this is very true in schools across the country, in that textbooks do not contain fuller history, particularly the ones we use in Catholic schools, on the history of Black Catholics from the beginning of the church. And so as educators, we use the books that we've been given, but there is a need, and as we will talk about in the very next slide, there has been a directive given by the USCCB to Catholic schools This last one was, as we talked about, in Open Wide Our Hearts from 2018, but this same directive was given to Catholic schools and teaching institutions over 30 years ago, in 1988. So we call on our religious education programs, Catholic schools, and publishing companies to develop curricula relating to racism and reconciliation. And if we were to do that and actually take action, then we would be moving from just simply being unracist or non-racist to being anti-racist, to actually take action and do what social justice teaching tells us that we should do. And in the words of St. Ignatius Loyola, the agere contra, meaning to act against. And so we must act against racism. And so again, a definition of what this means. To be unracist or non-racist is to watch the news, see an event, and sit there and think that it is disgusting the way that others are being treated, but we take no action. And so there is not a great sense of empathy that then moves us to taking action. To be anti-racist, that empathy, which is part of our Catholic identity, moves us to action, beginning with educating ourselves first and foremost, and then acting in ways to work to eliminate this bias formation. As Catholics, living this Catholic identity promotes the kingdom of God and promotes what we as Catholics say that we are. So, if we are talking about a tool for Catholic schools that can help reduce bias formation, we need to think about what successful anti-racism curriculum needs. What are the components to make it successful? Decades of studies by child psychologists who are experts in the field of bias formation in children determined that it needs to be intentional. We need to be sure that this is not a second thought and it's sort of thrown in here and there in our curriculum, that it is very intentional. It needs to be long-term, not just a one and done. It can not just be a February or November event. It needs to be repetitive, which means that it needs to continue from school year to school year. It needs to focus on internal quality and empathy. And as Catholic educators, that's one of the blessings that we have. That's one of the things we're able to do. We are able to say, this is not how Christ would want us to act. This is not the empathy that he shows us in the gospel. And for all of the saints that we use as role models for this Catholic identity, we always focus on their internal qualities, not their outer appearances. The other thing that a successful anti-racism curriculum needs is to be able to create an overarching cross-racial identity, an identity that crosses over racial lines and becomes the bigger identity. And so I would ask you, and it's bolded, to please keep that in mind, because as we're going to talk about later, this is really where the power of Catholic schools lies. So the realities that we need to talk about is, how do children form in-group and out-group bias? What are the triggers and spaces that are fertile ground for this bias formation? What does it mean when we talk about domain identification? And does every child have the ability to identify in the domain? And in this situation, our domain would be a school or the classroom. And then again, the power of Catholic schools to have the ability to have all of these components for it to be a success. And so, as the title of this presentation states, we are talking about bias formation within children K through 8th grade. And so you might be thinking, why are we having this discussion, particularly with children who are so young? And unfortunately, the disturbing truth is that by the time a European American child, an Anglo child, reaches the age of 5, they have already amassed and absorbed enough media messages to have a negative connotation of people of color, and in particular, a fear of Black people. So if we think about that for a minute, those kindergartners who walk into school have already received enough conscious and subconscious messages that they have already been able to determine a negative characteristic to people of color. We used to say that biased children were the result of biased parents, and that was a standard line from, say, 50 years ago. But studies have shown that that is not accurate any longer, because a child has so many media opportunities right now that did not exist even 40 years ago, that it would be impossible for a parent to be able to keep up with every media message that a child receives. So this is why it's so important for parents and teachers to work together and to be a cohesive team. The other thing that the experts have found is that many white parents do not want to have explicit conversations with their children about race and bias. They are afraid that it will create an idea in their child's mind that doesn't already exist. And unfortunately, studies have shown that that is not accurate. And so we need to be very intentional and very specific in discussing race and bias, and an understanding that race does not only include persons of color, it includes whites also. So when we are talking about race, it is a discussion involving everyone. So let's take a look very briefly, very quickly, at these experts in bias formation. And my work and studies have been informed in particular by these 3 experts. Dr. Rebecca Bigler is a world-renowned lecturer, textbook writer, textbook contributor, Hollywood contributor. She has served on boards for presidents, and she, full disclosure, was one of my psychology professors at the University of Texas. And she has spent the last 25 plus years really concentrating and doing in-field studies on how children form bias. And so in doing that, she has determined that there's sort of 4 results that are pretty clear for children. They are predisposed to develop and maintain social stereotyping. So if you think about a child's brain as a slab of concrete, and when you roll it out, it is pliable and you can form it. And if we're talking about building a room, you can make a closet, you can make extra shelves. And so while that concrete is very malleable, that's the best time to be making those types of opportunities. And so if, as we talked about earlier, there's all of these media messages that are coming in to children, and if with regards to people of color, they are overwhelmingly negative, then that is the information that gets put into that child's closet. And if there is little to no positive information or real live lived experiences with family and friends of different ethnicities, there is very little information in that closet that is non-stereotypical. Obviously, when children are older, they do a better job of being able to sort of categorize on a multiple level in traditional and non-traditional categorization. So I'll just take a woman. A woman can be a mother, a good cook, and an airline pilot. And I would say that still today, being an airline pilot is considered a non-traditional role for women. And so as children get older, they are able to do that, but they need to be able to see that.
I wanted to come tell you.
Some environments are specifically, I'm going to say, shaped or manipulated to make a certain attribute the most visible. So for children, typically starting out, sex, attractiveness, and race are the three most salient attributes that children first learn to categorize. And again, when children are small, they will notice she has blonde hair, she has brown hair, she has peach skin, she has tan skin, but there isn't a negative connotation to go with that information. All of that is learned through these media messages. So within Catholic schools, I would say that Catholic identity is the thing that the attribute that is most stressed within Catholic schools. And rightly so. It is the cornerstone of what we do. So again, keep that in mind. We're gonna tie that in with some of Francis Aboud's teaching. So one of Dr. Bigler's studies involved a group of students, about 30 of them, ages 9 to 11, boys and girls, all ethnicities, randomly broken up into two groups, and some were given a yellow t-shirt and some were given a blue t-shirt. And everything was fine until they put posters on the wall of child models who were wearing blue t-shirts and yellow t-shirts, but the posters with the blue t-shirted children had more academic and athletic awards. And just that simple addition of posters, even when the teacher did not reference them, created an in-group bias within the children with the blue t-shirts that their group was better, and a negative opinion of the out group, the group that they were not a part of, simply because of the posters on the wall. And so I would ask us to, again, keep that in mind. Whenever we learn the rest of the story, and this is number 4, modest personal and group views are linked to reduce stereotypes. Whenever we have a more modest view of our own in-group, then it gives us a better and higher opinion of the group that we don't belong to. So in this particular study, she broke the kids into 2 groups, same ages, and they read a story of a white individual and a Black individual, and one group didn't hear what I call the rest of the story. They didn't hear about the prejudice and the racism that was either perpetuated by or received by the biography that they read. The other group of students did learn about the racism that the Black individual had had to live with. And in that situation, what was learned was that when the rest of the story was told, Anglo students had a more modest and realistic view of their in-group. And because of that, there was a higher understanding and opinion of what you would consider the out group or the other group, because there was an opportunity to be empathetic. There was an opportunity to learn what someone else's lived experience truly was. Because for America, even today, we are still a very segregated society, and Catholic schools are very segregated. So almost 80% of the students in Catholic schools across the country are Anglo. And 85% of the teachers are as well. And so in this very insulated sort of area, it is harder to really get a firsthand knowledge of someone else's lived experience who is not necessarily in your in-group. So if we move over to Dr. Claude Steele, his work centered on the theory of domain identification. How do students identify in the domain? How do we make sure that they feel valuable, that they feel like they have a place and a contribution to make to the domain, and that their lived experience and the lived experience of their family is being respected and shared? So Dr. Steele has determined through his years of work with Black students that if there is not the ability to identify in the domain, if it's you don't feel like you can achieve someone's expectations, or there is a feeling that your teacher has a stereotype against you and that she feels like you will not be able to connect with the material or achieve at the same level that other students will, these students will do what's called a protective disconnect, because at times it will seem hopeless. And so if I try, but I'm always made to feel like I will never succeed, I will never achieve, it feels so much safer to disconnect. So this is why it's important that representation and lived experience and the history of multiple cultural groups are taught in school. Now, Dr. Frances Abood is the psychologist who, through her work, determined what anti-racism curriculum and programs need to have in order to be successful. And again, I'll read them because they're very important. It needs to be long-term and repetitive, not a one and done. It needs to concentrate on internal qualities. It needs to be able to create a cross-racial category of inclusion, and it needs to encourage empathy. So all of these studies were done in public school settings. So several years ago, when I was in grad school working on my thesis, I came to Dr. Bigler and said that I would like to theorize her work into Catholic school settings, and I wanted confirmation from her that my theorizing was correct. And she said, yes, it was. So just to give you some background on this work. So if we theorize these four findings of Dr. Bigler's, to just say there could be a woman who is an airline pilot is not as effective as saying, here is a picture of an airline pilot who is a woman. And so this is where a Catholic history is so important, that from the very beginning of the church in the Bible through the early centuries to present day canonization causes for the first African American saint, we have always had Black Catholics in the church. There have been 3 popes from Africa, but this material typically doesn't get taught in school. And so this, for our Catholic history, from the very beginning, we have facts and not just possibilities. Now, if we look at outcome 2, and this would tie in with the experiment with the blue and the yellow t-shirts and the posters on the wall. So together with outcome 3, if, as we talked about before, Catholic identity is the most salient identity that we want our children to take, and we put posters and statues in our schools that give them role models of Catholic saints to emulate and Catholic saints who lived their Catholic identity. What does that say to the child of color if there are one or no depictions of Black saints or Mary and Jesus with darker skin? What happens when children of color do not see themselves represented? And a step further, what does that say to the Anglo children? If Catholic identity is the most salient attribute and the cornerstone of our schools, and these are the role models that you have given me as an example of people who lived their Catholic identity, it says that my in-group is higher. Again, this is problematic. Particularly because within Catholic identity, this attribute, there is no out-group in the Catholic Church. So this is where the power of Catholic schools lies, is that if Catholic identity is the most important thing we do, Catholic identity can be and should be an overarching cross-racial identity. And because of our history, and because of our ability to be empathetic, and because the history of our church is so huge, Catholic schools can do this in a way that no other teaching institution can. Now, with regards to telling the rest of the story, when we tell the rest of the story, as in the American church's complicated and tragic history with slavery and segregation, then we are teaching our children the fuller, accurate history of our church, and it is apologetics, because if we do not teach our children this difficult history, someone else will, and they will not do it with the love of the church that we have. Also, truth-telling history is a wonderful way to have critical thinking discussions with students about following God-given authority and what happened when the Vatican said slavery was wrong and a sin, but the American Catholic Church continued to turn a blind eye. So our Catholic identity is promoting the kingdom of God. And so we can see here that there is a quote from Benedict XVI, and that proclaiming the kingdom of God is our priority. And the USCCB, and this is directly from the website, their characterization of what Catholic identity is and how important it is to what we do in Catholic teaching institutions. I will go a step further and say that Pope Benedict XVI said that the kingdom of God is not a place or an entity, it is a person, and it is Christ. It is that reunification of the divine with the human that we lost in the Garden of Eden. And so anywhere that there is sin, it blocks the full kingdom of God. And each one of us as Catholic educators work to form our students in the image of Christ, in the imago Christi. And so we must eradicate the sin of racism and take a difficult, hard look at the spaces within our Catholic schools that create and serve as fertile ground to form bias and prejudice. So how did this happen? And so this is Father Dr. Charles Curran, who is a leading theologian and catechetic. And he says, we did not even consider the Black Catholic perspective. My white theology was the theological standpoint from which all others were to be judged. This is clearly a position of privilege. And I have to applaud Father Curran for being brave enough, courageous enough, and honest enough, humble enough to admit this. This is part of why our textbooks do not have the fuller history of the contributions of Africans and Africans in the diaspora with regards to our church. And so when we're talking about writing curriculum and using historical records, I would ask us to think about this question that's very small at the bottom of the slide. Which internationally used historical account is the only one told from the point of view of the marginalized or the oppressed? And the answer is the Bible. And so I would ask you to imagine what Jesus would look like if the Gospels had been written by the Romans. He wouldn't look like the Jesus that we know. And so I use this example to show that perspective, representation, in order to have truth-telling curriculum is critically important. So how did we get from a little bias to institutional racism? Because all of us have a bias. I like chocolate ice cream over strawberry. You like horror movies over rom-coms. I mean, it goes on and on. So how do we get from that little bias to institutional racism? The media messages and social cues and how we categorize them. And if when our brain and our students' brains are young, we give them positive, accurate, non-stereotypical information that they can put in their closet and make new closets for that information and new shelves while their brains are still very, malleable. You can do it in high school, you can do it in college, but it's a whole lot harder. So if we're talking about the media messages coming in, then when a child sees something negative, they go to their closet and they say, wait, This is schema inconsistent. The negative information is schema inconsistent. And so then I reevaluate, and as they get older, learn how to determine truth from stereotype. And so consistent and inconsistent schemas then will create, as we talked about, that in-group and out-group bias. So what are our Catholic identity role models, and do they really reflect the universality of the church? So prejudice now allows us to make generalizations about people that we have never met because our closets are very skewed, especially as we talked about if we live in America in a very segregated de facto society. They will be skewed if we have little to no interaction and relationships with those outside of our in-group. And so that's why it is so important that as educators, we teach the fuller history of the church. If we are in the dominant group, we can use our power and prejudice together in racist acts, which was the current event slide. And we talked about privilege, which is the power. So I have the bias and I have the power. And so then those become racist acts on who belongs in the space. How can we adjust our prejudices and our biases and have a more modest in-group opinion of, who is the dominant group? Who is the group with power? And why do I have the power? And is it my place to even exert that power? And lastly, then, that bias and racism then becomes what we see today in institutions. Education, as we talked about, from punishment, church, housing, interest rates, financial, banking, redlining, all of those are examples of institutional racism, where the experience of the dominant group is the only one considered, and there is no representation of anyone other than the dominant group at the table. So it is important that there are multiple lived experiences at the table. So now with this information, what do we do with that information? How can we make a change? How can we go from being unracist to being anti-racist and work to fulfill the obligation that the USCCB has given us as Catholic educators? And so right now, I would like to introduce you to the enrichment program, Black Catholic History, which are lessons that are taught in Catholic schools across the United States and in Uganda. The program started in 2013 and is integrated into social studies, religion, and English language arts classes. So if I can just take a minute, and I'm going to stop my share. And I'm sorry, it's taking a moment. I had it up. I don't. Can you see, this screen?
Yes.
Okay. And I'm sorry, I don't, oh, here we go. So this is the landing page for Black Catholic history. And if you scroll down, you'll get a little more information about what the program offers, together with testimonials from just a few teachers, clergy, whose parishes use the program. I'm going to log in right now and provide you with just a brief view of the information. And I apologize for the internet taking so long to do this. But actually, this will allow you the material is under the section. And if you look at the categories on the right side of the screen, you will see that the larger categories are broken into African history, then American history, the Blessed Mother, which teaches the story of the Vatican approved apparition in Rwanda, Our Lady of Kibeho. Let's Meet, which is interviews with inspirational Black Catholics, religious, we can filter Vellum to the cause of 5 of the 6 candidates for canonization. Each one of them have a series. We have civil rights section, which talks about the work of Black Catholics within the civil rights throughout the years. We have language arts, which is primary source material for middle school teachers, pen pal opportunities for the younger students, and reading guides for books that literature classes may choose to read. The Saints, the specials, we are working on material for music and art classes, and then state history. So 4th and 7th grade is typically when state history is taught in school. And so we try very hard to have material, state history material, for all of the states that have a school in them. You can also filter it by grade level. So I'll go to if I can get back to sharing the screen. Oh, I'm sorry, you gotta. Nicole, can you look in the resource section to get an idea of so this particular series was created for 3rd and 4th graders. And as soon as the page pops up, here we go. So the material is written in grade level appropriate handouts. And there is a series on each one of the canonization candidates. All of the work of Black Catholic history is vetted by someone from the Black Catholic community who is directly connected with the material. So a member of the Historical Commission for the Canonization Cause vetted the work on Father Tolton. The Sisters of the Holy Family vet the work on their foundress, Venerable Honorette de Lille, the work on the African history of the early centuries of the church was vetted by Father Dr. Jerome Ledoux. And so it is very important that the material not only be factually correct, but that the tone is correct as well. At the bottom of the handouts, you'll see that we ask our students and our schools to please pray with the intercession of Our Lady of Kibeho. So if I'm gonna try and get us to, here we go. We'll pull up the 8th grade material. So you can see that the 8th grade material will either be marked by a notation of grades 5 through 8, or it will have an MS on it, which then means that obviously it's written at a higher level and you're able to have more intense critical discussion. Or with regards to language arts, it also means that this is where the primary source material is located. So I pulled up this particular handout or lesson, which is an actual manumission paper of a young woman, Angelica Gideon, who was a student of Mother Mary Lang's in Baltimore at the school, and she was enslaved. In Baltimore, in Maryland, it was not illegal to teach enslaved persons. But at the end of her school time, she was going to have to go back, and Mother Mary Lang and the other sisters raised money, saved money, purchased her and her sisters freedom. Now, of course, Father Jobert, who was the French priest, who was the pastor, he actually entered into the legal agreement. But this is an actual manumission paper from the archives of the Oblate Sisters of Providence. There is a translation. And then below it is research that I have done on exactly what happened to Angelica Gideon. And she grows up and ends up becoming an Oblate Sister of Providence. If we go to the resources, and this is where the application comes in, and this is how we can achieve those goals of being repetitive, long-term, not a one and done, is by ensuring that this material is taught throughout the entire school year. So I'm just going to pull up the enrichment suggestions from the Diocese of Arlington, Virginia, and you will see where we have taken the core curriculum standards for every grade for social studies, religion, and English language arts. And we have shown the faculty exactly how and where you can use the material. So then I'm going to scroll down a little bit just to say a fourth grader or a fifth grader where you can see that there are many, many opportunities for them to use this material. Before faculty use the material when the school purchases the subscription, then there is a 2.5-hour training, half-day workshop that the teachers go through, which is more involved, but along the same lines of the presentation that I gave today. And 4 times a year, Black Catholic History sends out a newsletter with new events, things to read, and an upcoming list for the next few months of feast days that the teachers could take advantage of, because there is a handout that correlates on our program. So I'm going to stop the share right now. I'm going to go back to the original one, and I'm going to shut us, kind of close us out here. And just a reminder that Black Catholic History is repetitive. It is all year, all grades. It's integrated seamlessly in social studies, religion, and English language arts. It concentrates on the internal qualities, and because we are Catholic and we emphasize our Catholic identity, and there is no out-group in the Catholic Church, this program can help Catholic schools create the overarching cross-racial identity that is needed for anti-racism curriculum to be successful. And so I thank you so much for being here today and for going on this short journey with me. And I would tell you that tomorrow from 1 to 2:30, I think I'm going to have a vendor open where we can go through in more detail and look at the material for anyone who would like to join. And if you go to www.blackcatholichistory.com, at the bottom of the screen, you will see a contact us portion. Please reach out to us and we will follow up with you directly on ways and how you can access this material and bring Black Catholic history to your school.
Thank you so much, Kaye. Thank you for all of the work that you are doing. This is a phenomenal program. I'm so very excited to learn about it. And thank you so much for presenting it to us and for educating us about it.
Absolutely. Thank you. Y'all have a blessed day.
You too. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.